Tēnā koutou kua hui hui mai nei, mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehi o Otipoti nohu nei au, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, ko Craig Cliff toku ingoa, he kai whakahaere hōtaka hua waru kore ahau I te o tākou whakaihu waka, mema hoki ahau no te komiti o te pauarahi, Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So welcome everybody to this webinar on standardisation in school design, organised by Te Pauarahi Learning Environments New Zealand, but made available to members across Australasia. My name is Craig Cliff and I will be chairing today's session. In my introductory mihi, I acknowledge the ancestral and spiritual landmarks of Otipoti, Dunedin, where I reside, and I'm already feeling red in the face because the evening sun is streaming into the side of my building. Some might say an unseasonably warm afternoon here in Dunedin. I acknowledge those landmarks. I also acknowledge the mana whenua of this area. But because we've got people joining from all over Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, I'd like to also acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all of these lands. To set the scene and create this meeting space as a special place of coming together, I'd just like to say a quick karakia timatanga. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. So this karakia talks about ceasing the winds from the west and the south and letting a red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened edge and a touch of frost for the promise of a glorious day. And we wanted to set that scene to talk about standardisation in school design. It's a topic, standardisation, that can mean different things to different people. Part of the kaupapa of Learning Environments Australasia is the bringing together of people from across different disciplines to work towards what's best for education outcomes. So bringing us all together today to discuss this topic really aligns with our purpose as Learning Environments. One of the outcomes we're hoping for today is a better understanding of what aspects of standardisation are being considered here in the Aotearoa New Zealand context, and ideally how this is being informed by lessons learned elsewhere, including from across the ditch. So this two-way communication is really, really important. Here in Aotearoa, we've just had a ministerial inquiry into school property, and one of the focuses was on efficiency, both in terms of time and cost of delivery. And already in response to that inquiry, we've seen some statements from the Minister talking about how over 60% of new classrooms are being delivered using offsite manufacturing. And the question sort of remains, how much further down the standardisation path might we go here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? How far should we go? What are the important considerations when thinking about education and the needs of diverse learners? So if these are burning questions for you, you've come to the right place. Very shortly, I'll hand you over to our first pair of speakers, Dr. Fiona Young and Rachel Liang, who are both based in Sydney, and they're going to speak about recent design studios at the University of Technology Sydney that were aimed at rethinking school design and the themes that emerged. So a nice sort of big picture entry into the benefits and costs of standardisation and a view from across the ditch. Then we'll hear from Mark Potter, who's the current president of NZEI, which is New Zealand's largest education union, and he's also a primary school principal by trade. So Mark's going to talk from an educator and a school leadership perspective about the pros and cons of standardised and modular designs, and in particular the need for these designs to be inclusive and support inclusive education. Then it's time for the New Zealand Ministry of Education to take the stage, and speaking on behalf of them will be Bernie Cruz from their school design team, and he'll explain how the ministry is responding to both government direction and feedback from the education sector when it comes to standardisation and efficiency. And then finally we'll hear from Matthew Webby from Athfield Architects, and he'll talk from a New Zealand architectural perspective, particularly the recent he's been doing with the ministry on standardised designs. So by the end of these presentations, we'll have more of an idea of what might be going on here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but it will still only be the tip of the iceberg. So we've allowed plenty of time for questions and answers. The full session is scheduled to run for up to 90 minutes. We can definitely wrap up sooner if questions peter out before then, but equally I know that our presenters are also keen to continue the conversation, and in particular the ministry is keen to hear from you if you've got more detailed questions or more detailed feedback. So in a little last piece of housekeeping in terms of protocol, if you have questions, it would be great if you could put them into the chat. If they're in response to a particular comment during the presentation stage, it might be worth noting who the question is for and what it is in reference to, because as we come back at the end of the shared presentations to that Q&A, we might have lost some of that context of what you are asking in relation to. Unfortunately, Rachel, who will be part of the initial presentation duo, will need to duck away shortly after her presentation, but if you have specific questions about her content, we can make sure that they find their way to Rachel afterwards. So that is all the housekeeping that I wanted to cover. I'll stop sharing that intro slide and get ready to throw you to Fiona and Rachel. So Dr. Fiona Young is a person with many strings to her bow. She's an architect at Hable in Sydney, a researcher with the University of Melbourne's LEARN program. She's a member of the New South Wales Government's Architects State Design Review Panel, Sydney Catholic Schools Capital Planning Committee, Learning Environments Australasia's Research Subcommittee, and more. So she was really a great get and was one of my first choices when thinking about who could we get from across the ditch to give us a perspective, and bonus points for actually being a Kiwi pretending to be an Australian. So we'll hear from Fiona, and then she'll flow through directly into Rachel's presentation, who is currently working at Dunhillman Architecture and Urban Design in Sydney, and previously whilst she was studying she participated in the 2023 Unschooling Masters Studio at University of Technology Sydney, which was co-led by Dr. Young. So I'll now throw to you, Fiona and Rachel. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig, for such a fantastic introduction. It really brings back the Kiwi roots in me, and so it's very nice to hear. So it's fantastic for Rachel and I to be able to join this really important conversation that we're both having across different sides of the ditch. And as you mentioned, we're approaching it from quite a different perspective from what the other speakers will talk about, because this is from an architectural master's studio that I've taught over the last couple of years about different ways of approaching school design. And in particular, the course Unschooling is very related to this topic. So just to contextualise the challenge that we explored, and these are probably challenges that you're exploring as well, but over here we've got a number of issues that we're addressing, that we've got increasing demographic pressure, which is leading to the urgent need for school facilities. And then whilst we're dealing with this, we're having to balance equity, sustainable design and value for money, yet we still want to meet the pedagogical needs of young people into the future. So that stared us into this research question: what might a scalable system for school design look like? So I'll talk a little bit about our approach to finding answers to this, because that was very important, and then also some of the findings. So first of all, we had loads and loads of conversations with lots of different people to get different perspectives. This ranged from principals to teachers to developers. You can see Stephen Heppel there, anthropologists, and we also spoke to Pasi Solberg. And he really encouraged us to think about this from a system-wide perspective. And in doing so, this helped us all think through this research question very holistically, and we thought it made us think much more deeply about the purpose of schooling today. And we also had a really fantastic talk from Megan Bozeman from Schools Infrastructure New South Wales about the current template that's being employed across New South Wales. But conversely, we also heard from Professor Stuart Green, who's based at Reading University in the UK, and his work is very much around, or he uncovers the myths and the unintended consequences of modern methods of construction. So the students had a lot to draw upon as they analysed the current school infrastructure template, which last year was very much like this, with the 9 by 7.5 grid. And these are some of their thoughts in looking at the template. They talked about issues with fences on the boundaries, which gave a sense of a disconnect or a barrier to the community. They talked about issues with a lack of ability to connect to the natural environment and to the potential for outdoor learning opportunities, and how we needed to be able to think more about catering for diverse learning needs and styles with more diversity of space. Importantly, along the way, we engaged with students. So we understood through their lens what it was like to be as a learner, and we also got their feedback into the designs that were emerging. And through this process, the students in their particular teams articulated a manifesto which articulated their values for how they wanted to approach the design. And here are some of the values that are coming through with one particular team. So then, of our 4 teams, each student in the team had a different site, and they were very, very different in scale and type. And this allowed each of the students to test an idea across multiple sites to see how scalable it was. So 2 of the sites were in highly dense urban areas in North Sydney, and these 2 are brownfield site, Chatswood and Lachlan's Line. They're both around that 10 to 14,000 square metre size. We also looked at a more of a suburban medium density site, and this is Penshurst, which was an extremely difficult jam-packed brownfield site. And then at the other end of the scale, way out in Western Sydney at Austral, this is a 100,000 square metre greenfield site. So what did we find? Well, essentially there were 2 different factions in our studio, and half the class felt like we could still do this. We could have a good scalable system, but it needed to be a different form than the current rectangular form that the schools infrastructure were basing their template on. And then the other half of the group thought that they were very strong in believing that we needed a new process and approach for designing. So starting with the physical responses beyond the standard box that we were working with, this student talked about the need for articulated forms, and by having more articulation in the form, you can see that it starts to create interesting spaces in between, and how it can start to build up really valuable outdoor learning spaces between each of the buildings. Another student group started looking at hexagon shapes because they found hexagonal forms offering a wider array of connections between the different spaces and across different scales, and it enabled better connections indoor to outdoor to create more protected spaces. Another group of students looked at circular forms because of the way in which they had, well, based on the research, it had positive impact on people. Another student looked at taking a kit of parts approach, and this, she found, enabled her to tailor more her solutions to across quite different sites. So then moving across to process approaches, this Team Eclipse, felt that we needed to think about systems in a different way, in a much more process-based, or the way of process. So that's what they needed to achieve long-term sustainable fit-for-purpose outcomes for the community. And the way they did this is they designed a website to demonstrate how you could interface with a large cross-section of the community to develop a participatory design approach to ensure that you ended up with a much better long-term outcome. And they acknowledged that doing this might not be as quick as more of a cookie cutter approach, but then they suggested having a modular interior system so that schools could have a temporary place of inhabitation, whether it was a vacant commercial tenancy or another vacant site, and as an interim measure, and then when their schools were built with them as part of that process, then they could relocate these modular elements to a new building. So that was a really quick snapshot of some of the findings before I hand over to Rachel to talk about what her team found. But if you want to know more about this process and about both of the studios, this QR code will take you to there, but I'll also put the link into the chat. So Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Fiona. So my team, which was Team Hyphen, created a new Schools for Community guide, which was a new type of template that was the more process-based approach. So over 6 weeks, we decided to critique the current template. And then after another 6 weeks, we applied our findings into the 3 sites, which involved a lot of constant testing and application of this new template form. The bigger picture for us was basically how could schools better celebrate the diversity of our communities? So we found with the SINSW template that it achieves these 3 outcomes very well. And in doing so, it produces light touch and rapid build approaches that very much cater for the increasing demand for schools in New South Wales, and overall is a very good business model for efficiency. But it's important to think about schools not just in that lens, right? It's important to think about what the students and the community needs. And what they need are schools that are future-proof and robust. Not only that, but also impactful for students and make a lasting impact on their lives. And that sort of thing really required a model that was slower and more thoughtful. So in order to do that, we needed to see schools as more like community hubs, and we needed to reframe them as the hearts of each local government area. Instead of creating schools where community groups book a space after hours, we proposed that schools actually influence their pedagogy and design based on the community interaction at the same time. So that also resulted in a space where intergenerational activity could flourish both day and night. So instead of a standardized design, we see the outcomes as more appropriate to be standardized. Pictured here are the chapters of a new proposed design guide, which you can see works at many different scales beyond the school site. So working from a precinct scale all the way down to the human scale. Some of our key strategies were based around stripping back schools and giving them more purpose. And to do so, one of our first strategies was to decentralize schools for all around New South Wales. To do so, all schools are K-12, which means that there's a more engaged collaboration between students of all ages. Within each school, there's a shared community function, and each of these specialise in a subject, whether it's visual arts, STEM, or performing arts. To do so, the timetable had to change, so each student would visit a different campus each day, which creates better immersion in the subjects and also allows for councils to better consolidate their resources to create better state-of-the-art facilities. And all of this creates a place where students feel safer in their local environment and are better acquainted within their communities. Looking into safety a little bit more, we really tried to look at forms that created safety beyond fencing. And a lot of these ideas came from increasing the passive surveillance within an integrated community facility, as well as creating elevational separation or pedestrianising the precinct. On our Austral site, we also thought about, creating community levels on the ground floor so that you could separate and secure upper floors for classrooms. Ultimately, a lot of these ideas are to set up students to be independent thinkers. We as educators and designers have to think into the future and equip students to handle real-world situations. And this means that for the students in later stages, we wanted to create larger and more fluid learning environments so that students had more autonomy with their learning. The design of each specific learning environment was also influenced by each pedagogical discourse for that stage. As Fiona said, we based a lot of our research on consultations with students from the Linfield Learning Village, where students asked for more play and home-like structures, as well as places for refuge, and teachers asked for more centralised storage, adaptable teaching spaces, and for technologically advanced teaching equipment. And all of this could be created and achieved through bespoke designs of standardised outcomes. So ultimately, we want to create a place that is for all to contribute and to activate the school in a unique way. And through doing this, it's important that we consider multi-generational learning that's beyond the classroom. So we have not only students there, but also people from the community that contribute to the learning outcomes. And of course, on the other side of the scheme is to consider how we might keep designers on track with the right goals. So we've formulated a set of measurable goals for each chapter where the size of each web indicates the success of that project. And of course, we had to apply that to our own projects, which shows that they're not perfect, but act as a stepping stone for what we might improve on. And that based on, as well as post-occupancy databases of surveys from all the students and teachers, might also ensure that pedagogy continues to influence future designs. So what I learned from the 3 months of working on this project is that the current template prioritizes different things. For our studio, we chose to put people first before profit, but we identified that there's no solution that's completely correct and right, and it's up to us as educators and designers to determine the future of our students. And here again is a QR code for the very lengthy design guide that we put together. Thanks so much.
Wow, that's amazing. Thanks so much, Rachel and Fiona. And it's great that you've got some artifacts that we can share with the people participating today. I know you need to run away really quickly, Rachel, but I'll just see if there's anyone with a burning question specifically on what Rachel just presented. You can raise your hand or pop something into the chat. In the meantime, I'll just take a few highlights from that. So do I understand right that it was 12 weeks that you had to be able to go through that whole process and you ended up with a design brief at the end of it? So that's a bit of a challenge to the Ministry of Education presenters coming up. Bernie, you've got 12 weeks from now, and we'll look forward to seeing the design guide. But that's amazing, and I really like the point about what are we trying to standardize here? Are we trying to standardize a template, or are we trying to standardize the outcomes? So that was really, really great. So I'll let you duck away, and we'll connect you with anyone. Oh, so we've got a question from Michael. How do you encourage community use in planning or site planning? Any reflections on that?
I guess it would come down to analysing at the forefront what each community requires. And so the approach for our design guide is to identify what is missing or what that community is most known for, and to provide those sort of needs concurrently to what the students need. Yes, but again, populating that sort of community function to the public interface with the street is something that you would always consider as a priority.
Wonderful, thanks. So Fiona will be sticking around for the Q&A after the other presentations, but thank you once again, both of you, and we'll now pivot to the educator's perspective. So I'd like to introduce Mark Potter. So as I mentioned before, he's the current president of NZEI Te Rui Rua, and he also has 30 plus years of experience as a principal in rural and urban schools, from teaching principal positions to walking principal positions. He's a really passionate advocate for social justice for all children to have the right to an education met, and especially those with disabilities, and he is a member of the Education for All Forum. So I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Kia ora, Craig. Tēnā koutou, koe te manakura o NZEI Te Rui Roa, ko Mark Potter tōku ngā, ko the tumuaki o te kura o Berempō ki Pōneke. So I'm the president of NZEI Te Rui Roa, which is the biggest education union in New Zealand, and we represent members from early childhood through to secondary age, teachers and principals, particularly in primary area, and the teachers in ECE, but more support staff and admin staff in secondary schools. So it's quite hard to bring everything down to just 5 to 10 minutes of things to share, because there are so many things to talk about. But one thing I will stress is I'll talk at times about my own experience with a modular design, and I'll also talk about my colleagues' experiences as well. And I think that's one of the points that designers need to take into account, is principals and teachers all talk to each other. And so it's very common for them to go, do you know anything about this design? And that's where modular actually becomes a bit of an advantage, because I know in my own experience, for instance, when we were first suggested to look at modular classrooms, I spoke to a principal who had them. And that was really helpful because the principal could gave me quite a good positive feedback about them. It was a bit of a sell in New Zealand because we had 50 odd years of very poor quality relocatable buildings being put in. And a lot of people were very suspicious that's what they were getting, but that's certainly not the case with the modular designs we have. The modern modular is a far, far more superior product. There are obvious advantages because with the known design, you know what you're looking at. Timeframes are quicker if it's built off-site and brought to the site, but that also brings all sorts of issues with that as well. The advantage of the modular being like Lego, you can actually plug in different options. Makes it easier for people to make decisions. So, for instance, there's a lean-to option on the classroom that we received, and we had an option of that they could plug on either a storage space, as Rachel taught, that was quite common for teachers to want. We could plug on withdrawal teaching space. What we opted for was an accessible bathroom facility, because the distance from any other toilet block would have meant that was very much a requirement for our school. So you get greater options, and you're not spending as much time arguing over, is it going to have lino, is it going to have carpet, and so on. There are some disadvantages that go with it. We did experience damage from transit, and a lot of principals did say that, but that was very minimal and very easily fixed. So just if it got jostled at the wrong place, maybe a cistern on the toilet got cracked, and that's just pull out, replace, easily done. I did hear quite a few principals talking about materials that were in the modular design weren't suitable to their environments. So the far south of New Zealand, it gets extremely cold. But the thing about having modular designs is it becomes a learning system. So that once that was realised, those materials were replaced, and then that got factored into any future designs. If you're in this kind of environment, you don't use that form of material and so on. So it became a growing way of doing things. Certainly, location is a little bit more tricky because if you're doing bespoke, you can build into and onto existing buildings quite easily. But that's not necessarily the case with a modular design. So you've got to be very careful about where to put it. And of course, everyone's got a bright idea until you get the experts in and start to realise that at the moment, a lot of those bright ideas aren't that bright to start with. We do know that one of the other issues you can hit is if you are the first to have a modular design in your council jurisdiction, it can actually slow it down remarkably, because every council wants to make sure everything is correct, and they don't seem to trust each other. So we were the first to get a certain modular design in Wellington City, and we found that caused a few problems to start with. But in areas, councils where those modular designs had already been in place before, it wasn't such an issue. Our principal said that was fine. Efficiencies can be lost if the offsite building goes ahead, but then it can't be delivered to the site for some reason. That starts creating a cost. So our Ministry of Education was incurring costs for buildings that had been built, but for whatever reason it couldn't be delivered at the school site end. So there are some of those risks that have to be taken into account. So sometimes savings might not be there just because a delay occurred. In our own school situation, it was COVID. COVID came in, and wow, it put so many problems in the way of the progress. And so we initially went into a modular design thinking it'll be quicker than doing bespoke, and it turned out to be almost the same amount of time. But still, we wouldn't have gone with the bespoke because we think that would have just created more issues as well, trying to fit into what was a 1970s design. So what I would say to people is, if you are thinking about standardisation and a modular approach, don't get carried away with toys. Principals and teachers will tell you they much rather have good design before they got exciting new gadgets and toys. In fact, often new gadgets don't work too soon after it's completed. So yeah, don't get too clever. Children have not changed fundamentally for the last millennia. So classrooms, a lot of people think you've got to change classrooms to a degree you don't really need to. Pedagogy was put under pressure for a while from a lot of people saying we need to change classrooms, so teachers need to change to match the classroom designs. That's not where that should be happening, and I think you've seen in Rachel's presentation, pedagogy needs to be understood by architects before they start designing classrooms and set up situations. I know architects need to actually experience being in environments which I think is very informative. My father was a building painter by trade, and he used to say every architect should paint at least one building they design before they do another one, because often what seems great architecturally isn't actually in practicality. So that's something to take into account. Craig mentioned that I'm a great advocate for inclusion in education. And one of the most difficult barriers that diverse learners face is often the actual physical building itself. So that needs to be taken into account. And I've seen beautifully built classroom blocks, especially around down in Christchurch, where we had the rebuild around the earthquake. And every access point bar one is steps. And so there's only one place for someone with physical disability to access a 7-8 classroom block, and that's not designed for all. That's not inclusive design. Not only is it physical aspects and accessibility needs to be taken into account, visual, audio. I did ask one principal, if you had your time again for one of the brand new, what was supposed to be one of the flash new design schools in Christchurch, I said, would you do it the same? He said, if I had my start again, I would say I'd do away with architects. The first meeting I'd have would be with an acoustic engineer, because they got this beautiful designed classrooms, but the noise in them were not good, particularly around children with autism. And so there's a real drive towards larger spaces. My own school, we moved the other way. We had an open plan build from the 1970s, and we took out a lot of the openness because it did not work for children who had sensory issues. But it doesn't mean you can't have flow. So don't look down on boxes. Boxes, you can actually, a good teacher can teach in a barn, right? So you don't need to go too overboard on great big spaces. There's very few great big spaces I've seen that cater for all needs. You also want to avoid some really simple things. For instance, there's one thing we actually learnt in our modular classroom. It was actually brilliant, great accessible ramp. It was accessible bathrooms in there. The interior was brilliantly designed, and there was like a 2-inch lip on the ranch slider to get in. And it's just that one little tiny thing, which they did figure out a solution for later for us. But it can be something as simple as that can cause a problem for somebody. So when you are designing, look for design too. And I think it might be, Bernie might talk a little bit later, because everyone feels they're unique. And to a degree, there is uniqueness, but uniqueness can be added in touches. Rather, the DNA of buildings is 85-90% the same regardless of where you go. But you do want to make sure that people still feel they can put their touch on things. Otherwise, you end up like you always think you're being unique yourself, but you realise as a kid you end up being dressed just the way your mother wanted you to be dressed in the first place. So you don't want to be forced into being like and looking like everybody else. So that's a real quick run through. The last thing I do want to say is you've got unforeseen problems everyone knows about because they're unforeseen. For instance, an example with our modular classroom we got was it was actually 6 metres too far away from the nearest access point for a fire engine, which required a $60,000 movement of gates and ramps for accessibility for our school from our car park area up into the main terrace. That's an unforeseen one. What a lot of principals and teachers tell me about is the unseen problems. And by that I mean children versus construction sites. The disruption in the design process does not often take into account the impact on children and the teachers and the stress on the staff of a school to work their way through whilst construction and things are going on. We were very lucky with the modular classroom we had, that we could actually literally lift it over from a road onto a site that could be isolated. But so many of my colleagues talk about the difficulties they have and the ongoing issues of children being crammed into school halls in order to free up enough space for the work to go ahead. So it takes a lot to work that through. And I know architects, drafts people, contractors think they're working at pace, and they are in their professions, but it's not in the world, a day-to-day world of a school community, and that's a tough challenge. So that needs to be taken into account. I've come to so many areas where they say, "Oh, we'll just bowl the whole school, and it'll make it easier to rebuild right from scratch." But what they do is they then put the children and the teachers in an untenable position, and then inevitable delays start, and then you start to get stressed schools and communities. Children start leaving schools. It's the kind of thing that really needs to be thought through as well in your design process. So I'll stop there because I've got so much feedback I had from other people to talk about, but I think they are the main points to think about as you try and think through the design process for any school. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Mark. Thanks very much. And you covered a lot of ground there, and fingers crossed some of those themes, or most of those themes, might be covered in the next two presenters in terms of the thinking that's going into these designs, because these are all really, really important considerations. One of the things you said really early on is principals talk to principals, and that is true. And we're all in these kinds of conversations today. I'd highlight one of the comments from the chat is that this session is being recorded as well. So if you've had colleagues who are registered but can't make it, then they'll get the link as well. Feel free to share these messages with other people as we go through the process. We'll just move on now to Bernie and who's talking on behalf of the Ministry of Education. I'll put in apologies from Trent Whitten, who's the Director of Strategic Asset Management at the Ministry, who was down to also talk today, but is unfortunately unwell. So Bernie is flying the mantle solo for the Ministry, which is sometimes not an enviable position to be in. So thanks very much for joining us. Bernie is the Chief Advisor in the Design, Infrastructure and Digital part of the Ministry of Education. He has been there since 2017, but previously he's worked in the construction industry, asset management, project management, and building supply. So he's got a really broad understanding of all the things that go into making a building and making a building for education. So over to you, Bernie.
Thanks, Craig. Kia ora, everyone. I'd just like to say thanks to Mark, Fiona and Rachel. Really interesting comments, and I hope everyone asks them a lot of more questions than they ask me. Okay, so I'm just going to cover a little bit of context. I know there's some Australians on this call, so really quickly jump through some context setting about where we've come from, and maybe some of the current problems we have, and then I'll jump into standardisation and what we're looking to achieve in that area. So really, I'm going to really briefly, in a nutshell, about 35 years ago, we moved from being a centrally controlled asset owner manager with a departments of education and a Ministry of Works that undertook all of our construction to a devolved model where essentially we became a funder. That was in '89. And then 25 years ago, we created some very, very flexible policies around how much space schools can have and what they can do with that space. And essentially, we said, as long as you don't go over your total bucket of space and you don't eat into teaching space, you've got absolute flexibility to do what you want within reason, to deliver your local curriculum in your local community. 10-15 years ago, we started to play a more central role with major works. A couple of events happened in New Zealand, and also we were seeing things that we weren't quite happy with. Started to publish some design standards. 4 years ago, we released a school property strategy, which signalled a shift to becoming a more involved asset owner. And I think today we're in a position where we recognise that we're actually a really important kaitiaki or guardian in the field of, long-term social assets. And some of our approaches in the past haven't allowed us to fulfil this guardian role as well as what we could do. So in a nutshell, this is the school property strategy that I spoke about. There's kind of 4 pillars, quality learning environments, a sustainable portfolio, well-managed property, and equitable outcomes. And whenever we bid for money from the government, we kind of try and speak to how we're going to be addressing those things and whether it's about growing, transforming, maintaining, or complying. And as you probably know, there's never enough money to do everything we would like to do. We are doing a lot more work now than we've ever done, and we've recognised that we need to develop more sustainable practices. We've got 3 simple challenges. How do we prioritise where our limited funds go? How do we ensure our property is well maintained? And how do we deliver new work on time and on budget? And as has been covered by Craig earlier, there's been a lot of noise around this from reports and inquiries and the Minister and government and ourselves, and essentially standard designs and offsite manufacturing is seen as a good solution to our problems by our leaders. And just adding to that, so a lot of the noise at the moment is around time and money issues. We've also seen some really variable outcomes in terms of learning environments and assets. We've got some schools that haven't been able to operate in their new buildings, and Mark touched on a couple, and I'm sure he's got hundreds more stories about that. And for example, some spaces where there's an intent to enable flexibility, but in fact what we've done is created a restrictive environment where they can only operate in 1 or 2 modes. Our policies around areas are really complicated and unclear, and we kind of throw that problem to an architect to figure out, and sometimes that doesn't work and sometimes it does. We also have, a very real dilemma around decisions made by previous designers in schools are sometimes problematic for future school staff that might move in. So, for example, if we build a new school with a leadership team that then moves away, a new leadership team come in, and sometimes they don't quite like what they're receiving. So that's a problem we need to think about. And also our assets can be complicated and onerous to operate and maintain for a teacher or a school that doesn't have dedicated facilities management teams. So that's a whole lot of problems, but I think that poses us with a really cool opportunity in New Zealand where we can look at improving outcomes across a range of areas, as well as achieving government directives around delivering faster and cheaper. And essentially the goal that we are looking to achieve with standardisation is about better outcomes at all the different layers. So it was excellent seeing that slide in Rachel's presentation. We are looking at better outcomes for spaces, for buildings, and for school sites, and for their communities, all within the kind of world of standardisation. But also as a government entity, we need to acknowledge our role in being an enabler for modern methods of construction and manufacturing in New Zealand. New Zealand's fairly new to offsite manufacturing, modern methods of construction, and the amount of volume that we're putting through, there's an opportunity for us to be a leader in that area. But that doesn't mean we're putting all our eggs in one basket. We kind of strongly believe that a design suitable for manufacturing should also be quicker and easier for a local builder to be able to whack up in a much quicker time. So just covering what we're working on with standardisation, the obvious is the standard buildings and the materials and the systems we use, planning processes. So hopefully some people are pleased that we are certainly focusing on process and planning, and I think that's actually where we will make our biggest gain as a good client, and as giving more certainty to the industry about how long is something going to take should mean we see things delivered faster and cheaper. We're also looking at replacing the education brief process that we have with something that's a little bit more user-friendly for schools and designers. So looking to move towards something which is fairly industry standard in more mature environments overseas, functional briefs, and we'll look to develop some classroom layouts as guides for a conversation starter rather than a blank piece of paper. The other aspect we're looking to develop are better briefing packs for when we engage our consultants. So we're clear as a client what we want, and our stakeholders, our consultants, are clearer on what they need to do to perform and deliver for us. Overall, what so we're developing these kind of 4 areas of standardisation, and we're looking to develop that for both English medium schools, so schools that teach predominantly using English, and Māori medium schools. So in New Zealand, for those that aren't from New Zealand, we have a network of kura schools where they have a completely separate curriculum, and all is teaching in te reo Māori, and there's a number of different peak bodies that are delivering this education to Māori and other Kiwis, and so we're looking to partner with these groups and ensure they get fit for purpose facilities as well. If anything, we're actually more ahead with our Māori medium program than we are with English medium schools. We're also researching what elements make up a functional site and for a given cohort group and a size of a school. Something that we've seen with Australia and other jurisdictions is they're really clear on what makes up a good school, And because we've been devolved for such a long time, we don't have that intellectual property just yet. So that's something we're looking to develop to help us with understanding prioritisation, where there might be gaps in a school facility, etc. These, I won't dwell on the next couple of slides too long. This is just a graphic representation of the 6 buildings we're looking to develop. Everything from a relocatable to a big multi-storey double depth building. Matthew will talk about some of that later. When we're thinking about standard designs, we are thinking about the layouts, the user aspect of it, and we're thinking about the technical building asset aspect of it as well. So we're being very conscious. We're focusing both in parallel. If anything, the user needs to inform the technical, and that's the approach we've taken so far. We've got further in our functional brief and layout process than we have with our standard designs. You would have seen from Fiona and Rachel, a kit of parts approach was seen as quite positive way to go about things, and from our engagement with other organisations internationally and in New Zealand that are further advanced than us, we would agree a kit of parts approach with modular interchangeable parts and spaces seems to best support our overall objectives. And we know that schools, sites and communities can be unique, and we know that schools will have their preferences for layouts, but we don't need to start from scratch every time. So we'll be looking to develop a kit of parts approach. Eventually these might make their way into buildings that we don't have to touch too much, but we always want that ability to be able to respond to a site or to a school's needs without having to throw a standardisation out and go to bespoke. And so what we're trying to do with our kit of parts approach is ease the burden that we're currently placing on schools by showing successful examples, allowing us to have more cost certainty for our annual programs of work, reducing the cost of construction through national agreements for materials, and we also have opportunities to explore facilities maintenance in certain areas where there might be some value in that and where schools might want to opt in or opt out of that. They're the things that we're talking about. So in a kit of parts or a standardised building from a technical perspective makes that a lot easier at a national level. In terms of how we're developing standard designs and standard processes, we want to do a lot of learning from what we've currently got. So we've got a large amount of data and we've got some good research capability in the ministry. So we're tapping into this information to support our understanding and produce some evidence-based solutions, even if they're just a starting point. So as an example, we've got hundreds of education briefs that we can draw upon. We've got a number of post-occupancy evaluations. That's a really good starting point that we need to look at. And when we're looking to develop standard designs, there's already a lot of information that we have in our folders and file systems. We want to apply best practice processes to ensure we're delivering the right solutions in the right places. We're really keen to strike that right balance of collaboration and risk sharing as we develop standard designs with the industry. So creating an environment where there's genuine innovation can happen rather than an innovate or die burden placed on our supply chain. And of course, we want to engage with education practitioners and experts as we develop our designs. I think it's really clear to me that education outcomes are our reason for being, and if we don't create environments that work for schools, we're essentially not doing our job properly. I think, this is going to be a multi-year process. When we talk to other jurisdictions, they're way more advanced than us and they've been going for years. So We bear with us. We want to take a learn as we go approach. Getting started is our focus. We're going to put some stuff out there, but what we want from very interested people like yourselves and other experts in the field is to collaborate. We want to hear your feedback. We want to be undertaking reflective practices in-house, and we want to be undertaking a number of post-occupancy evaluations so that we have this continual improvement of what we are producing and what we are saying as a good example or an exemplar. That's all I have. Look at that. That felt really quick. I'm sure it was way longer than what you wanted, Craig.
No, that was good. Thank you, Bernie. And we've got questions popping up in the chat as well, and we'll let Matthew have a talk in a second. But one I think is probably quite specific to the ministry is from Glenn Irwin, who's asked. Well, it's quite a long one, and I'll try and condense it. Apologies if I mangle it, Glenn. But with like new technologies or newish technologies like BIM, and then generative design and AI-driven fabrication, these things are sort of coming down the pipeline. How much are you looking at the potential that these innovations might have, these technological solutions that might mean bespoke solutions come back into being easy to deliver without significant cost increases? Is this something that's on your horizon?
That is a big question. We are absolutely looking to utilize technology as we develop this work. But what we have learned from engaging with Australia is that can actually take quite a long time. And we've found that, I don't want to say this the wrong way, and someone from New South Wales might be on the call, but I got the impression that it could be a distraction for the resources that you have. And so we want to be really careful that we are not letting any kind of digitalization evolution get in the way of just getting started with good designs and good processes. They will certainly come. And we are already piloting and proving some concepts in the digital world. Yeah, I won't talk too much about that now, but we're certainly on the radar.
Yeah, I get the impression from the learn as we go approach that you're not excluding these opportunities.
No, absolutely
you've got an
not.
open mind.
Yeah, that's right.
And like Mark talked about this as well, with the materials might not have worked in one climate, but because this is a more standardized process, the ministry wants to hear where it doesn't work and can feed that back into the future design. So that's not just for material choices, but it's around broader quality concerns.
Yeah, I'd like to think we'll address that, and maybe Matthew will cover some of that in his chat.
Yeah, that's a wonderful segue. So I'll do a quick thanks to Bernie, and then introduce Matthew. Matthew Webby is a principal and registered architect at Athfield Architects, based in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. So another representative of Te Waipounamu, the South Island. Matthew specialises in leading multidisciplinary teams to design and realise complex education and public projects. And he is going to take the floor right now. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, it's been fascinating talk so far. So as Craig said, my background and most of my career has been in the space of education and community facilities and delivering those across Aotearoa. The practice I work with and many of my colleagues at Athfield Architects, our focus is always on kind of creating buildings that respond to their place, their users, and their community. So I guess standardisation on the face of it doesn't necessarily kind of align with that perfect fit. But in the design of our buildings, we are kind of often doing those iterative refinements, but focusing on those bespoke outcomes. At the end of 2023, we were challenged by the Ministry of Education to come on board and start to consider some of those standardised two-storey building typologies that Bernie had on his screen before. And look at kind of, as Benny was saying, how we can achieve greater efficiency, certainty and quality. And I guess, you know, we're very cognizant of the broader drivers, and, you know, really committed from our own perspectives around that, you know, delivering quality learning environments to our communities around the country. And I guess that approach of the kit of parts was arrived at quite early on in our discussions, and something that kind of really resonated with us around allowing the standardization, but allowing some degree of that configuration to respond to those kind of bespoke outcomes. The work that we've been doing has certainly not been done in isolation. It has been done really closely with the Ministry of Education, and we've had a spectrum of really talented consultants who collectively we've been developing these different models for two-storey building technologies. And I guess looking forward, we're really optimistic to be able to expand this list in front of us and find ways that we can develop that kind of feedback loop, so that the work that we have started continues to get refined rather than continuing going on many different tangents. We through the process of developing those standardized approaches, we narrowed down on 3 key strategies. First being that kit of parts to achieve that efficiency in design kind of upfront. You know, there's a lot more certainty when we first have those conversations with the school. Pre-construction and construction, while maintaining the ability that we can come up with responses that are both specific to the school and specific to the context that they're in. At the heart of it is really a structural grid, which is regular, or that's where we arrived at, and then a series of moves that adapt the corners, the edges, and a free space in the middle that can be configured to the response of the brief. Much in the way that a commercial building is typically built, where there is a base build and then individual tenants come in and fit out the interior, but with the ability that, you know, we can work with schools and their context to configure those parts. This comes together in a fairly technical kit of parts, and this is where there's, you know, a need for a huge amount of research, development, feedback loops, to avoid some of those things that Mark didn't give my profession an overly glowing reference for, so that we can make sure that we aren't making those mistakes, and making sure that we are learning from their best exemplars out there. When we think of standardized buildings, there is often an assumption around volumetric offsite manufacture, which is where chunks of buildings are manufactured offsite, craned in place. Our working hypothesis, which maybe in the long run proved wrong, is that an elemental approach to offsite manufacturing is most appropriate for buildings on that kind of two-storey larger format scale. When we take into account there being a strong driver from the ministry to keep the interior plans fairly unencumbered by things that get in the way. Standardising an approach across New Zealand is not as simple as it may seem when we take into account the significant variation in both seismic and climatic conditions that we get in across our country, and that's something that much more work needs to be done into working out whether it's better to design the solution that fits all, which would be arguably over-engineered in some contexts, or design specific and therefore lose that standardization, and, you know, where it sits in that spectrum in between. The fundamental to the kit of parts approach is arriving at that structural grid that is permissible to the spectrum of rooms that are ultimately going to be housed within the building, and that flexibility has been considered both kind of on day one and into the future, acknowledging that these buildings want to be assets that last a long time, and as we know, for anyone that's kind of worked in old schools get configured many times over their life, and so fundamental to this grid is arriving at something that permits that flexibility long term. We derived those grids through extensive precedent analysis, structural optioneering, noting that kind of the different structural grids have different structural implications, and a series of test fits kind of looking at how we can create a common grid that works for both kind of cellular power to two kind of arrangements, open plan, and critically, the one that I guess challenged us the most was around how you actually fit in specialist spaces, which often require those larger format kind of open spaces. And within that, there's also the question around the scalability. So within the single loaded model that we were looking at two-story buildings that housed between 6 to 12 teaching spaces and any permutation between. So far I've talked about the building in isolation, but kind of fundamental, and this kind of goes to our approach, is the acknowledgement that these buildings need to be site responsive. Having a standardized building that ignores its context is unlikely to be a successful building. And when we look at our school campuses across the country, they are in no way standardized. And fundamental in our thinking was that we wanted to come up with a kit of parts that could be responsive to local climate, to existing built environment, to cultural context, and those fundamental things around getting sun in the right place and putting edges in the right areas of campus. And our view was that kit of parts approach provides a degree of flexibility that allows us to engineer the best outcomes for both building and the wider campus and the interaction between the two. And in our view, this is very pertinent because on the whole, where we're looking at those two-story buildings getting applied is around where campuses are densifying. And yes, it may be easy to put it on the periphery, but it's unlikely to be the most appropriate spot. So as we see this coming together, and it's safe to say we're keen to see these things develop and get tested against the spectrum of those real world briefs. But we're very keen to see these schemes developed so that we can deliver on those efficiencies and cost certainties, but also balance by investing in those areas where they are going to make buildings that are site-specific, acknowledge what the school is needing, and ultimately kind of deliver buildings that become valued by their schools and communities, and ultimately that in turn means that those buildings have custodians, which is the thing that ultimately means that they become long-term assets, not liabilities. To wrap up, I just thought I'd conclude on some reflections on the process that we've gone through. Acknowledging, as I kind of implied at the start, when we first started, there were a lot of questions internally that myself and my colleagues who were working on this faced around is this is this the right approach that we want to be backing? But through the process, what we've really identified is that, within our own practice, there has been certainly a degree of that iterative refinement and standardisation, as you can read to a degree with the plans on the left, which are 3 projects which we've been working on over the years. And what I think the challenge for us is for both to clients, to the client, the Ministry of Education, and to the design teams, is looking at how there can be much greater rigour around which of the bits which are acknowledged as standardised, and which of those bits that we can invest that time, energy, and deliver those really excellent results, while still balancing that need to create efficient buildings that are equitably delivered across the country. So I will wrap up about there and hand you over to Craig.
Kia ora, Matthew. That's great, and I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already today. One of the things that Bernie mentioned, it was the work in both English medium and Māori medium, and kind of Mark covered the importance of thinking about inclusive design, and particularly for students who might have different physical and cognitive abilities. Maybe I'll start with you, Matthew, in terms of cultural considerations. So not just thinking about Māori medium as a specific need, but how have you considered the cultural aspects that may present at different sites, and how your standardisation response can support that?
That's not something we're specifically engaged with any mana whenua on. But I think it does kind of go to the heart of the approach that instead of in terms of these 2-story buildings, instead of it being a standardised building that you can maybe change the colour on the corner, that it's a set of parts that if you get that engagement right in the early stages, you can be considering the placement of the building in terms of the campus, the placement of elements within the building, and I guess the working assumption that we've been working on is that those interior fit outs are done specific to the school, and so there is an opportunity there. Certainly something that I think justifies a lot greater interrogation of, but that's where we're at the moment. Bernie, I'm not sure if you...
Yeah, Bernie, any reflections, both with the work for Kura and more widely?
Yeah, so we've got a really good relationship that we've developed with Peak Body Te Runanganui. They're responsible for 67 or so kura around the country, and we're looking to develop a series of standard designs with them. And I guess we're leaving it as an open question at the moment, like what can be the same. And so Matthew touched on some, so maybe there's less concern about the structural system or what the facade materials are, but there'd be more concern about what the treatments that represent identity and allow slight variations to the types of practices or activities that might go on. So, for example, we are actively developing a gymnasium, and so in English medium, that gymnasium is typically just used for sport. In Māori medium, it's used for kapahaka and sport. So we have to think about what the acoustic treatments might be and what the storage requirements might be. And there might be sleepovers and whare kai, manaki type activities going on. So it's an open question. What can be the same and what needs to be different? And we don't have the answers yet. And we want Māori to steer that and guide that. then it just becomes the what do we add or subtract for different learning environments.
Mark, I wonder if you're able to chip in here. I know that Burrampore School has a really diverse community that it draws its students from fairly affluent people who may or may not have worked at the Ministry of Education in the past, to refugee families and everything in between. So thinking about that context of just your normal local school, but drawing on a wide range of cultures and socio-economic backgrounds, what might some of the key things that designers who are thinking about standardisation need to be looking out to respond to that kind of cultural melting pot?
Craig, Bernie raises a really interesting point around, particularly for entire Māori, is how the structure of a building can be seen and often is structured in a particular way that will bring identity to the people in that space. When you're dealing with multiple different identities, so Burrampore, I think our last count was 36. I don't think any architect can actually design any total way of incorporating all that. But what good architects will do is they create the capacity for people to add to their space, whoever is there at the time. So I always say to my teachers, if you took every child out of the school, could someone walk into that environment and still understand who spends their day there? And that tends to be the personal touches that the teachers and the children themselves add. So good designers think about, how can a learning environment lend itself so that they can display things, they can keep things in there that the child will identify with. I think that's the simplest way of looking at it.
Yeah, and Fiona, I'll just give you the opportunity from your experience, either in the unschooling studios or more broadly your work in New South Wales, and what are some of the potential fishhooks in terms of starting with a templated design and maybe where some of those have missed the boat.
I was actually just listening to the last comments about designing for Māori context, community, and just also thinking about the context here where the Government Architects New South Wales Connecting with Country framework is really a critical part of the process and very much central to the way in which we review projects through this Government Architects State Design Review Panel. And I'm also curious in the New Zealand context how important landscape design is as part of the process of this kit of parts design, because I can see in New South Wales it's absolutely critical because I guess we have a much more defined template that the most critical decisions are up front in terms of how you place them on the site to optimise the experience for that community and those students. And I guess because it's it is this 9 by 7.5 grid that is, in a sense, almost, it's not double loaded, but it's 2 classrooms, a large space in between the 2 classrooms. Then you have to make decisions about what's the orientation, who does get the west facing, how do you mitigate the sun on the west side. So I think there's challenges there, but also I think that connection to the outside is such a great opportunity for learning and learners. And I think that's where the landscape comes in, but also the challenge of how do you deal with that when it's more than one story? Like, how do you mitigate that situation where you end up with a whole lot of buildings in a row with a corridor that connects it, which can lend itself to that sense of being a bit prison-like. So that's a bit of a challenge. I think the other challenge too is the need for designers, possibly even as Mark picks up, to spend time in the classroom to see teaching and learning, because when you have more of a template model, then what's really critical is how you get some of the nuance on the inside. And so therefore it's really important to start to understand the learning settings that might take place, and then how you navigate the space and how you accommodate large groups or smaller groups, and therefore where do the screens go. And so you kind of need to get down to that fine grain of detail to really optimize the opportunities of the templates. So I think in some ways too, having this model can be a challenge, because it's almost like you follow the model. I mean, it's too easy to just follow the model and just put out these buildings without, it almost takes away the agency in which the designer should have in adding intelligence to what the model is.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And that links on some of your comments there, just link on to a question in the chat from Peter Stacey, which is kind of from a different angle. And he's talking about with new schools and the challenge of being an architect who's engaged before there's a school principal and school staff, and absolutely the students aren't there to talk to. So this is another, I guess, the standardization is creating that situation for all sorts of infrastructure solutions. So Peter puts that question to Bernie, like how do we get that in? And I think maybe if you could pick up on Fiona's comments around, if you've got some of the superstructural elements locked in, and then is like, do you see that as an advantage to let the smart creative people play in the soft fit out areas and those soft systems, as opposed to spending time starting from a blank sheet of paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about the mechanics, and then I'll talk about what we do to allow space for designers to be designers. So in the world of new schools, yeah, you're right. The system we have doesn't allow for principals to be appointed till a year or two out. And by that time, we've already had to get on with the design process and the construction process. New schools can take a long time to build. So we set up these groups called establishment boards of trustees. And I can use I won't name the school, but I'll give you an example, because I was there workshopping it, and we had 6 principals that were locals in the community and knew what the community wanted, and we had mana whenua iwi representation, and we had education experts and ministry staff and myself. And so in a nutshell, we're kind of mitigating our risk by bringing in some experts, and the goal from my mind is I want to design a facility, or we should design a facility that they would want to come and be a principal at. If we can land on a facility that they fall in love with and they want to be a principal at, we've kind of halfway done a good job. In terms of giving space for designers to be designers, that's essentially what we're trying to do within the process side of standardization, is take away the kind of technical stuff that can be a distraction, such as people having to discover what stormwater system we want or what foundation systems we want, so that they can focus their energy towards outcome focused areas that are pretty important when it comes to developing campuses. So around and essentially we've got a template which we've tested on new schools in Kura, which is a more designer oriented education brief, education questionnaire, where we ask them, we set out a series of questions which trigger conversation around what's important, what's not so important, because we want designers to, because we can't just say everything is important, then you you end up landing nowhere? And how often would a particular activity be undertaken, or which activities would be undertaken more than others? And Fiona, to kind of so we try and create this really clear picture of what's important for the stakeholders and the community and the educators, and then let the designer massage that into a site plan. And if anyone doesn't know, my favourite piece of work in any of this field is Fiona's research on affordances and the LENZ of affordances. And I'm not going to explain it because I'm going to do a really bad job, but essentially we're looking for design outcomes that enable the most types of practices and community uses of a facility, whilst also restricting the least amount of activities. So trying to create these very genuinely authentic, flexible environments where, as an example, your school hall is something suitable for PE, can be used by a church on a weekend, can be used for porphyry type monarchy activities, and so on and so on and so on. That's what we're looking to achieve with standardisation. Yeah, and that's how we go about it when we don't have a school on board. Hopefully I answered those questions.
Yeah. Really conscious of time is ticking, and I think there's lots of questions in the chat, and we've answered parts of them, and hopefully the most important parts to the people that were asking those questions. One of the questions a bit further up in the chat was around, you can't control all the variables in terms of time, price, and quality. So what's going to give, and have we talked about quality? I'm going to throw a couple more things. So the triangle becomes a square, becomes a pentagon, becomes an octagon. When you think about all the things we need to actually be optimizing, because you can think about space, and that's sometimes within New Zealand in particular, with the flexibility that Bernie talked about in the beginning. This is your envelope of space. So if you can play around with building less space, then suddenly your budget can go a little bit further. So that's one of the other things that you might need to be optimizing for, and the ministry might be wanting to be more rigid about. The other thing is environmental outcomes. So I noticed in Matthew, your image around the sort of kit of parts, talking about steel structure, and that might come with a reasonably high embodied carbon versus engineered timber, which might be lower, but those structural elements take up more space. And so how much are you thinking about the challenge of optimizing across a really wide range of concerns? And yeah, I guess my question is, at what point, how important is those environmental considerations when you're thinking about the government talking about price and time of delivery, and schools obviously focused on the quality of a learning space?
You're asking me that, Craig.
I'm asking you, I'm asking Matthew. Yeah.
I'll really quickly, was it Tony that asked that? It was Tony, I think. I think we have a huge opportunity to improve on all those metrics. I don't subscribe to you can only have 2 out of the 3. We're talking about being a better asset owner. We can improve time, quality, and cost easily, and all the other metrics at Craig. We've got so much headroom to improve. In terms of sustainability, I'll quickly touch some areas and give it over to somebody else. It's about progress. So we're making sure that we can set up these kitted parts so that we can swap out lower carbon solutions as things calm down in the world of time and money.
I can jump in and kind of expand on that. So in terms of the sustainability side of things, so in terms of what we've been doing, we ran through 2 processes, the first one being on that kind of double-loaded 2-story model, and then we repeated that process around the single-loaded process. And yes, we did derive both steel-based structures, steel and concrete structures. But within both of those exercises, we had we were considering that embodied carbon as a key factor. Its emphasis lessened over time, acknowledging political contexts. But that work was done up front. We had consultants engaged who actually looked at the life cycle costings of the various schemes on the table, and that in addition to a series of other what we deemed success criteria were added together, and kind of that derived the solution. I think there is a real tension around, speed of delivery, established industry, and lowest cost versus potentially doing something that is non-standard and expecting that you're going to get the cheapest outcome. So it's a difficult one to get all those things stacking up, but it was certainly a key emphasis from the team around the table to be having that on the table, and then, as Bernie was saying, kind of allowing and considering how parts could be swapped in and out as time evolved. And I think the key thing that we don't think it's necessarily quite cracked yet, but it's about that kind of feedback loop, so that we progressively improve on all of those metrics, opposed to kind of having making gains and then losing them. So
yeah, awesome. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for me from today's conversation is moving into the space of the feedback loop, of having the players within the system understanding the journey that we're on, and the ability to say, we've made a mistake here with this box we've built in Southland, and it wasn't quite up to the climate conditions, or actually there's an opportunity here to move to a lower carbon construction method, and that could be scaled. So I take heart from that. Time has flown by. I will now wrap up this session with some thank yous. So first of all, thank you very much to all of our presenters, Rachel, Mark, Fiona, Bernie and Matthew. Thanks to Deb and Pip behind the scenes for helping to set this up and get this out and advertised, and thank you to everyone who came along. At one point we got over 150 attendees, which was really, really impressive out of the 200 odd registrations. So there's always a bit of attrition, and people have other things on the go. So if you know of a colleague who did register but couldn't make it because of other things in their life coming up, they will get sent this link. And thanks to the social media subcommittee of Learning Environments New Zealand as well for helping to promote this event. Takeaway message is you are part of the conversation out there in the audience, and hopefully you got the message that people, including the ministry, would like to hear from you. Because I've set up the space with a karakia, the tikangas, I will now also close the space of exchange that we have established with another karakia whakamutunga. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru, tapu nui, kia wātia, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takata, koia rā I rongo, whakairea ake ki ronga, kia tina, tina hui e, tai ki e. Ka mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you everyone.